ban the physical punishment of children by their parents. In proposition are Ireland, represented by Killian Breen, Hugh Burns, David Byrne, and Hugh Burns giving a summary. Please welcome them. And in opposition, Israel, Shimon Friedman, Noam Darhan, and Joseph Kalman, with Shimon Friedman giving a summary. Please welcome The judges are me, James Brobrook from England, Jordan Ward from New Zealand, and Janet Webster from Canada. And our timekeeper is going to signal at 1 minute and 7 minutes and 2 knocks at 8. Sorry, what name is? Ariana is our timekeeper. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to call upon Killian Breen to open the case.
Mr. Chairperson, sir, distinguished adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, Team Ireland stand before you today in strong proposition of the motion that this House would ban the physical punishment of children by their parents. And we do so under our team line, inflicting pain brings no gain to the child or society. And we come to you with 3 substantive points today. Firstly, how physical punishment harms children. Secondly, the limits of parental choice. And finally, the need to change how society views violence. And what now I would like to do is examine our first 2 points on how physical punishment harms children and the limits of parental choice. But before I do this, I'd like to examine the contemporary relevance of this debate and why we are looking at this topic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, historically, parents have been viewed as having complete control of the family unit. And we've seen a massive unwillingness by the state to restrict or intervene on this right. We have seen the state placing the family unit and its upkeep as a state priority, placing it above all else, ladies and gentlemen. But in more recent years, we've seen a step away from this view throughout the world. We have seen an increase in persecutions in cases involving parental abuse, such as the major case of Joseph Fritzl. We have seen steps to reducing the rights of parents in deciding vital aspects of the child's life. For example, in education, they are now allowed to choose how to educate their children, but they're not allowed to choose not to educate their children, ladies and gentlemen. This shows a recognition by the state that it is okay to reduce parental rights to protect children. And a view by the state that now they believe parents are not always best placed to make these decisions and should not always be granted absolute control. We have seen a growing trend throughout the world to stop corporal punishment. We have seen its complete removal from both prisons and schools, ladies and gentlemen, and we have seen steps towards banning the physical punishment of children by parents. For example, in EU countries such as Denmark, it has been banned outright, and in Britain we have seen a prominent anti-smacking campaign to show and highlight the dangers of it, ladies and gentlemen. And all this raises the question, should parents be allowed to physically punish their children? Now let's look at what the model and definition Team Ireland bring to the table. We would define parents as either the biological parents or the legal guardians of the children, ladies and gentlemen. We would define physical punishment as any punishment which inflicts pain on the child, such as hitting or smacking. And finally, when we say we would ban physical punishment, we mean we would make it illegal. And we would enforce this ban in the same way we see currently existing systems in place to stop parental abuses. We would go through the normal channels that these systems use, in neighbours informing the authorities, to teachers observing the students in school, through doctors' examinations in hospitals, and through the reports of social workers to monitor the occurrence of abuses throughout our society, ladies and gentlemen. And in the cases where abuse is found or physical punishment is found, we would enforce the parents to attend parental classes and anger management to teach them the harms that they are causing. And in more severe cases, we would impose jail time, financial fines, and in the most severe cases, we would have the children taken away from the parent and put into care, ladies and gentlemen. And this leads on to our first substantive point on the harms to the children. For ladies and gentlemen, inherent to physical punishment, there is a certain degree of physical harm to the child. Hitting or smacking children invariably inflicts pain on them. It subjects them to assault, ladies and gentlemen. And assault is completely unnecessary, for there are many other ways to discipline these children, ladies and gentlemen, which my colleague, Hugh Burns, will look at in more detail. For parents physically punishing the children is just merely based on the parent subjectively deciding that the child has done something so heinous that they deserved to be hit. That they had done something so terrible that the child could inflict physical pain on them, ladies and gentlemen. We see that this involves certainly a degree of anger in the heat of the moment, ladies and gentlemen. The parent will not hold back to the same degree they would if they were calm as when they were angry, as they lose control of themselves. And under the state, yes sir, I'll take it.
Yes. If they do lose control, that would indeed be abused. As you said,
yes, sir, thank you. But what we see is under the status quo, where we allow parents to physically punish their children, it leads to, in the heat of the moment, them stepping towards physical abuse, and leads to them stepping over the line and abusing their children. What this would do is completely remove the unnecessary danger to the child that this incurs, ladies and gentlemen. For under the status quo, we allow parents to inflict this physical harm on the child and allow them to go on to abuse their children, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, sir. We see that even in our prisons, those who have committed the most heinous crimes are held. We do not inflict corporal punishment. So we do not understand why we would inflict it upon the most vulnerable and weakest in our society, ladies and gentlemen, our children. And coming on from this, we see massive psychological harms caused to the children. For children are going through great change in their lives, ladies and gentlemen. They are often very scared of the world. So they need to view their home as a sanctuary, as somewhere where they can feel safe, somewhere where they can feel they can develop. For ladies and gentlemen, picture the effects of a child viewing their home as somewhere where they feel unsafe, as somewhere they view with fear. Yes, sir?
Simply allowing punishment of any kind will view...
No, sir, there is a great difference between allowing a parent to physically hurt a child, to physically assault a child. This causes a much greater degree of fear, as the child sees the parent as an absolute authority figure who, if they merely step out of line, will turn on them and use physical force to discipline them, ladies and gentlemen. This is destructive to the vital role a parent plays in the child's life. The child will no longer view them as the loving, nurturing, guiding parent, but simply as an authority figure, ladies and gentlemen. Someone to be feared, not someone to be loved, ladies and gentlemen. The parent will begin, no thank you, sir, to become a source of trauma, meaning the child can never fully develop. Now this leads on to the limits of parental choice. For in society, we grant certain rights to parents to make decisions for their children, ladies and gentlemen, such as allowing them to make medical decisions. But similarly, we take certain rights away from children, such as their right to vote or to drive. But crucially, this is not because children are lesser people. It is simply because they are not mentally developed enough to understand the decisions they will be making when they are voting or when they are driving. The right to bodily integrity is different to these, and it is not based on mental incapacity, ladies and gentlemen. There is a precedence for taking away rights from parents, ladies and gentlemen, already in place to protect a child's development, such as we see in the reduction of a parent's right to educate their child, such as the existence of a state curriculum, so that the state tells the parent what to teach their child to ensure that child fully develops. And just as we have seen previous laws against things like child labour changing parental views towards child labour, we believe this will lead to corporal punishment ultimately dying out, ladies and gentlemen. So under the team line, inflicting pain brings no gain to the child or society, we stand in proposition.
Thank you very much for that opening speech. And now to open the case for the opposition, it gives me great pleasure to call upon Siobhan Freeman.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, just quickly, now that I'm done with the formalities, I think this is going away because it's way too hot in here. Now, I'd like to open today's case for team opposition. Now, before I get on to telling you exactly what we will be saying in team opposition, and before I get on to refutation, let me tell you what team opposition believes today. And what we are supporting today is minor physical punishment as allowed in status quo to children under the age of 6. Now, the reason we choose children under the age of 6 is specifically because we believe that until the age of 6, a child has not developed cognitive thinking, or cannot understand abstract ideas in which after the age of 6, under the age of 6, you can. And that's why we believe that these are essential for a child under the age of 6. Now, in status quo, now, before I go on to refutation, let's just see what we do in status quo. In status quo, this is allowed because we understand that the government can only intervene in a case in which this is abuse or assault, and that is something that team proposition has to come up and prove to us today, which first of all, I'll discuss in a moment, they did not prove, no thank you, but my second speaker will be addressing that a bit further. So what exactly will our case be made of today? I'll be giving you two levels of analysis. My first level of analysis will be about a child. My second level of analysis will be an analysis of physical punishment. And finally, my second speaker will give you a point about the rationale of parenting. Now, before I do that, let's look at what team proposition gave to us today. Now, the most crucial thing that they had to do for us today is tell us why exactly these harms, why staff punishments and things like that are abuse. Because they kept talking about status quo, and in status quo government does certain things to restrict parents. But under status quo, the only time that we restrict parents is when it's either abuse or neglect. And neither of those were shown to us by team proposition in their points. Now let's look, at the 2 points that they presented to us today. The harm to child. And they said, ladies and gentlemen, that when the parent is angry, he will act under anger and then harm the child in a disproportionate way. But first of all, ladies and gentlemen, if he in fact does that, then that is abuse. And abuse under status quo, no thank you, isn't allowed anyway. And so if they present to us the idea of sending them to anger management, fine. Then send the parents who create abuse to anger management. Sorry. The second thing we'd like to say to that, ladies and gentlemen, is even if you ban this idea, if you truly believe that anger is such a big problem, then why will this change? Why will suddenly the parents no longer be angry and won't hit the child just because it's illegal? No, ladies and gentlemen, we don't believe that. And then they say, ladies and gentlemen, that this will create fear within a child. And first of all, we'd like to say that how is the fact that, why is this such a severe case that only this case will cause fear within the child? Why is another punishment not going to cause fear? And the second thing we'd like to say is, why is fear, why is looking at your parent as an authority figure such a bad thing? We believe looking at your parent as an authority figure is something extremely important. Yes.
Isn't an authority figure which teaches you that the solution to problems is violence, not the kind of authority figure you want the child to have going?
No, ladies and gentlemen, because we don't believe that in every case this will be used, and we see that yes, ideally we wouldn't use this punishment, but as I'm going to prove to you in my point, this is the only way we have with the children under the age of 6 to really portray them and help them not harm themselves and also not harm others. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we got a whole point in which they spoke about the parents and said how, no thank you, in status quo, governments intervene. And we agree, ladies and gentlemen, governments intervene. But this goes back to the whole idea that team proposition, to win this debate, has to show us how this is abuse, and therefore government should intervene. And this is something that we did not hear from team proposition. Now let's move on to my first point, no thank you, the analysis of a child. Now let me just give you a quick recap about why we want to do this under the age of 6. Because we believe that after this age, this is also the age that we send children to school, is they can start to understand abstract ideas. They start to have, no thank you, they have a different perspective on life, and you can explain something to them that they don't necessarily feel upon themselves. No, thank you. So what we see is that a human mind, we have to split into a child and an adult. Because an adult a mind works within associations. Now, this is relevant both to a child and also to an adult. But the difference is, ladies and gentlemen, in an adult's mind, that he can create associations with things that are abstract. He realizes, even without putting his hand in the fire, that there is going to be pain if he puts his hand, no thank you. And that is something that a child, we see right now, a child doesn't do. We see that I can look at a fire and think it's pretty, and I think it could be very interesting to touch that fire, but I realize, because I've been explained to many times, no thank you, that if I put my hand in the fire, I will get harmed. Well, on the other hand, we have the child who cannot understand that unless he puts his hand we cannot explain to him that that pain exists. We see that, ladies and gentlemen, in status quo, that's why children, for some reason, tend to, pick spiders' legs off, because they don't understand the pain they're inflicting on that spider unless it is inflicted upon them. That's why children demand attention, because they don't realize, no thank you, that if not all attention is addressed, that if all attention is addressed to them, none is intended, no thank you, no attention is addressed to other people. They cannot understand things that are explained to them in an abstract way. They only understand physical ideas. Now let's move on to the analysis of a physical punishment.
Before that, sir.
No, thank you. Well, what we see we see that in status quo this is allowed. Now, what we're going to try and understand is why in status quo we believe that this is so essential for the child to really have this physical punishment, as we said, a slap on the wrist or something like that, rather than just explaining to him the whole idea. And I said that in the, let's look at the difference between a non-physical punishment and a physical punishment. So we said that physical punishment is an attempt to implant an abstract idea in a child's mind. You're trying to explain to him why something is bad. No, thank you. But they don't understand what danger is. They don't understand these abstract ideas. But on the other hand, we have physical pain. No, thank you. And we understand that a child does understand physical pain. Because, as I said, a mind works with associations. And if I, as a child, have got a smack on my hand every time I try to put my hand towards the fire, no, thank you, when I look at the fire again and I see this pretty thing that intrudes me, then I'm going to look in my mind and think, okay, fire, what does that associate with me? And in my mind, I see fire as pretty, as interesting, but I also remember that pain, that little slap on the wrist that I got from my parents when I tried to touch the fire. And so clearly there is a difference, and we have to prevent this harm from happening to the child. And because the harm is physical, physical harms is exactly what a child understands. And so the difference is, ladies and gentlemen, that in an abstract idea, you have to try and explain it to the child. And we understand that ideally, if we could, we would go ahead and only explain to the child. But we see that right now a child doesn't understand a simple explanation. He understands the actual pain that is being inflicted upon him. And if he can only feel, if he can only understand the pain that is inflicted upon him, then for his safety, ladies and gentlemen, because if I see my child running towards the zebra crossing without looking both sides, or running into the street without me, then I have to stop his hand and explain to him that you cannot do that. Because I can tell him 1,000,000,000 times that it's dangerous and that it's harmful, but until he sees that there is an actual danger, he will not understand that. And that's why we believe, ladies and gentlemen, that this is that it's physical pain and under the age of 6. So what have I shown you today throughout my speech? First of all, I showed you that the main idea that the team proposition had to prove to us is that this falls under abuse. They did not tell us. And they have to, for them to win this debate, they have to tell us why the rationale of status quo does not stand, and that's something we didn't hear. And then I came up and told you, ladies and gentlemen, I gave you the analysis of a child, why a child under the age of 6 doesn't understand abstract ideas. And then I showed you the difference between physical pain and non-physical pain. Because when we have physical pain, I have a negative association within my mind. I feel that pain whenever I see fire and I want to touch it. And for that child's safety, and for the safety of children that he may harm if he doesn't understand that hitting is wrong, for those children and for that child in specific, we have to let this motion fall. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks Siobhan for that speech. Just before we go on, could I remind our speakers to, when they stand up to offer a POI, to say on a point of information reasonably loudly. It's just I can't always catch when you're standing up because there are heads. Okay, so to continue the case now for Ireland and the proposition, I'd like to call upon Hugh Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you in the audience who know me will know that I'm quite a lonely guy, and there's really nothing I'd rather be doing on the night of Valentine's Day than standing in front of all of you and speaking. I'm sure there's nothing all of you would like to do, rather, on the night of Valentine's Day than sit and watch me speak. So, let's start. We on Team Ireland have brought to you the team line that inflicting pain brings no gain to the child or to society. And 3 points. The first of them was about how physical punishment harms children. The second was about the limits of parental choice. And the third one, which I will deal with later on in my speech, is about the need to change how society views violence. But before I move on to that, I have a number of issues of refutation with the previous speaker. I'm going to take a look firstly at the responses which he brought to our case. I thought it was very interesting that he said, we never showed how physical punishment is abuse. As I understand it, our entire first point was about showing how physical punishment was abuse. We told you, they told us that abuse, going too far, going in the heat of the moment, no thank you, and hurting the child is already illegal under the status quo. But here he misunderstood our point. Because what we are telling you is that when parents feel that it's okay to hit their children in the first place, and they're more likely to begin that process, that the danger that they will go too far, and that they will cross the line into serious physical abuse and serious physical danger is a lot higher. But secondly, we tell you that it's not the same as other punishments. Anyone who has ever been subject to physical violence will be able to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the assault, the domination of another person, the humiliation involved in a physical attack, and the violation of your most important sanctuary, that of your own body, cannot be compared to other punishments, like taking away your toy trains. What we tell you also is that the psychological effect of this, especially when it's being administered by the figure who you should love the most, by the figure in the presence of whom you should feel most safe, is unbelievable, unbelievably bad. So let's take a look secondly, no thank you, to their second argument. This idea of reinforcing the idea that children under 6 cannot understand abstract ideals, so we have to beat them into them. Well, here's what we tell you, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, we think it's pretty callous of them to say, we're going to pick on the most vulnerable people in society. We're going to pick on the weakest of all children and subject them to physical violence. We wouldn't inflict corporal punishment, no thank you, on the most heinous of criminals, but according to them, little Johnny deserves it. But what we tell you also, in terms of abstract ideals and trying to enforce this in people, it's perfect. Exactly what kind of ideals are you enforcing in children when you hit them as a solution to a problem? What we would suggest is that at that age, they may not know that violence is not accepted within society. But if they see the person who they trust the most, their parent, inflicting violence as a response to things that they don't like, the likelihood that that child will take that message to heart and interpret that abstract ideal is extremely dangerous, and that's not something we want them to do. So we do agree with their analysis that children under 6 are unable to understand abstract ideals, just disagree with them on exactly what abstract ideals are going to be reinforced. No thank you. Their second point dealt with the idea of physical punishments and why they were different. They told you that because these children can't understand abstract ideals, explaining things to them purely won't work. And I'm really confused here, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't understand why the only 2 possible options open to a child are beating the child or explaining things to them. There are plenty of other ways in which you can punish a child without inflicting physical assault, without inflicting all the kinds of damages which we talked about. Stop them from going out with their friends. Take away their toy trains. Don't give them sweets after dinner. It's not that hard, guys. I'll take you.
That kind of punishment is so indirect that the child would simply not associate it with the act.
That doesn't make any sense, ladies and gentlemen. If you directly, after they've committed whatever crime or infraction you're talking about, take away their sweets or say, no more trains for you, Johnny, that's just as much a clear causal link as if you directly, after they've done that, hit them. So, now on to take a look at the idea of reducing violence, or the need to change how society views violence. Because what we tell you is that corporal punishment sends a message to the child, the parent, and everybody else about violence, and a very negative one. I've already talked to you in rebuttal, and they've already talked to you as well, about how a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old doesn't necessarily understand complex moral theories, doesn't necessarily understand the difference between right and wrong, or the importance of rule of law. And they look to authority figures to emulate. How I act is not simply a product of me in an abstract vacuum deciding that treating other people a certain way is right or wrong. I emulate my parents, my teachers, all the other people, all the other adults around me, but particularly the people with whom I spend the greatest amount of time, those being, certainly at the age of under 6, my parents. What we tell you is that if those parents are people who inflict violence in response to perceived problems, I too am more likely to be a person who inflicts violence in response to perceived problems.
Sir,
I'll take you on this.
inequality between parents and children already exists. You don't want your child taking another child's toy train either.
My problem is not that there's inequality between children and parents. My problem is that parents are teaching their children that hitting people is a good idea. So, what we tell you is that while this isn't necessarily going to turn, while corporal punishment by parents doesn't necessarily turn every single child into a psycho, I'm sure some of the older members of this audience were themselves subject to corporal punishment at some stage, and certainly our judges are, at least some of them, are not psychopaths. But what I will tell you, yeah, I'm talking about you, Jim. And what I will tell you is that it creates subtle differences in attitude, subtle differences in how an individual is likely to view violence. And we don't know who will be the worst affected. We don't know who will be the borderline cases for whom how their parents treated them makes a difference as to whether or not they enter into assault later in life, whether or not they even potentially enter a life of crime. So what does our policy do? Well, firstly, and most crucially, it takes away this negative influence within the home. It takes away the potential for parents to teach their kids that violence is all right as a solution for a problem. No, thank you. But also, where violated, it shows to the children the importance of the law. The fact that not even their parents are free to assault other people with impunity. Not only that, but it does encourage positive reinforcement. Because we do like the idea that, as well as taking away little Johnny's trains and little Johnny's planes, you talk to the child about why what they did was wrong. We would suggest that simply a Pavlovian response, the sort of thing you use to teach dogs to jump through hoops, isn't necessarily the best way to teach a child about right and wrong. But where corporal punishment exists, it's seen as such an easy solution that parents are likely to avoid this, because they have this easy way out. What we tell you also is that it sends a clear message, not just to the people within the family, but to society at large, that violence is no longer acceptable. It completes the process that we began when we stopped punishing criminals with corporal punishments, when we stopped punishing school children with corporal punishments, to create a society where no person's bodily integrity can be infringed upon, where violence is never a solution to the problem. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a society that I want to live in. I don't know about you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that speech. We return now to the opposition team to hear from Israel's second speaker, Noam Dahan.
First of all, since you're feeling so lonely, Hugh, would you be my Valentine? So now that we've sorted that out, let's go on into the more important issues in this debate, and I will begin with refutation by refuting these four claims. Firstly, the claim that it is abuse and that it would become abuse. We're not too clear about which one that was. Secondly, the claim that it would make children not see their homes as a sanctuary. Thirdly, the claim that Hugh just made about how it would have a negative psychological effect on the children. And fourth, the issue of alternatives. So, firstly, we'll worry about the issue that they say that it is abuse or it would lead to abuse. Now, they say that they might have claimed that it's abuse, but really what we've heard from the first speaker is that they want to make it illegal because it would lead to abuse. They said that because in the anger of the punishment, because the physical punishment is illegal, the parent would lose all sense of proportionality and would hit his child in a way that would cause harm. And thank you, something that both teams recognize is indeed abuse. Now to this we have four answers. Firstly, you don't make something illegal just because it would lead to something bad. What you do, no thank you, is prevent the chain. Prevent it leading into the bad thing. What you do is prevent the transformation. And first of all, what you do is essentially prevent the transformation. That's a rationale that we apply to everything in status quo. No, thank you. Just because shiny objects might cause stealing, we don't ban shiny objects. We ban stealing. No, thank you. And so we see that just because something might lead into something wrong doesn't make the very original act wrong. Our second answer to this is that the parents have an instinctive, no thank you, need to protect the child. And so instinctively, simply by being their parents, they would not harm them significantly. Simply because they see this child, and biologically and emotionally, no thank you, and psychologically, they do not want to hurt it directly. And this is what every parent feels for his child, simply by virtue of loving his child and the child being his direct offspring. Our third answer to that is, in status quo, it does not lead to abuse. In fact, I believe that in some occasion, many of the debaters on both teams were mildly slapped on the wrist when they approached fire or put their hand on a burning oven. Yet, what didn't happen to the speakers on both teams is neither got punched in the face. No, thank you. We see that this does not lead to abuse in status quo. Our fourth answer is that punishment, all punishment, even taking trains, all punishment that parents apply should not be done out of anger. No, thank you. This is something parents should know. This is something that punishment, by virtue of being punishment, should be done from understanding, not anger. And so everything about anger is a bit irrelevant. Now, secondly, the children would not see their home as a sanctuary. First of all, as oddly as this may sound, they haven't really explained why this is bad. Because we might claim that if a parent is a good is an authoritative figure and a loving figure the rest of the time, don't get me wrong, parents shouldn't be like Mussolini. But if a parent is an authoritative figure when wrong things are happening, and a loving figure elsewhere, then they haven't really shown us what's wrong with that. Yes, please.
Your team has talked about when a child hits 7, they go outside into the big wild world and start learning a lot of new things. Don't you think when they go home, they shouldn't have to fear being hit by their parents, sir?
Well, after the first few times, they'll know not to put their hand on the oven. They'll know not to put their hand in fire. They'll know not to hit their brother or sister. And so this would simply by virtue of this punishment being effective, stop happening, and the frequency would be reduced. Now, which brings me to my second answer, that there are two main issues when addressing this whole sanctuary issue. The first one is frequency, and the second one is severity. As I said, the frequency would gradually be reduced and isn't that large to begin with in the first place, because we would now use effective punishment rather than ineffective punishment, and secondly, we don't really know why a little bruise here and there would lead to fear. And I promise I do have a few more answers, but really I'm running out of time, so you'd have to hear them from Joseph. Now, an answer about what Hugh just said about the negative psychological effects on the child. Yes, we also don't want the child to steal. Doesn't mean we're not going to take his train away, as you have suggested, and also, as we've said, inequality exists in status quo. Now, I'll move on to my constructive points very briefly. So, an analysis regarding parenting. As Team Proposition very kindly said, in a democracy, we allow parents to do almost everything because of 3 reasons. Firstly, they think about the child's best interest. No, thank you. Secondly, they have a biological connection, an instinctive need to protect the child. And thirdly, they know the child best. Now, which is why we accept them, no thank you, as the decision makers in the children's lives. But as they've said, the government does not leave everything to parental discretion. The government bans 2 things, abuse and neglect. Now, they've not really claimed that the physical punishment, mild physical punishment is abuse, just that it would lead to abuse, no thank you. And so we see that really the 2 things are abuse and neglect. We see that the criterion doesn't apply. Now, there's been an issue regarding harm and pain. It's important to distinguish, no thank you, between harm and between pain. Harm is something that causes lasting unnecessary damage. These are indeed the 2 criteria: lasting and unnecessary. Now, lasting doesn't mean for all eternity. Obviously, if you give your son a black eye, even if that's gone after a week, it's still abuse. No, thank you. And so we see it would lead to substantial damage, and it is unnecessary. Those are the criteria for abuse. No, thank you. bruises are obviously banned by status quo, and we're not protecting them. And so we're not talking about that. What we are talking about is mild physical punishment. No, thank you. No, because there is no danger that mild slaps would induce substantial physical harm to the child. No, thank you. We do not agree. We do not agree that they are harmful. Indeed, Team Proposition has conceded that the hitting itself is not harmful. And so we see that if something isn't harmful, in every other case in status quo, we don't allow the government to intervene with something that's not harmful. And yet, what the proposition wants to do is in this specific case, violate that rule. We don't see how that makes any sense. We've not been explained why that rule does not apply, and indeed it does. The government has no right to intervene with something that's not harmful simply because they think, the proposition thinks, it would lead to harm. And so, now, very quickly I'll move into the issue of alternatives. The thing is, what we've been trying to say about punishment is that this punishment is indirect and not as effective. First of all, because it's not felt on the child's flesh. If I go to the fire and I feel pain, that's very direct, and every child would get that. If I go to the fire, then hear a speech about how wrong it is to go into the fire, which I barely understand because I barely speak English, and then I get my train taken away after 15 minutes, that's not something they're gonna get. And so we don't have any alternatives. Just because it might lead to abuse doesn't mean it is abuse, and the government has no right to intervene. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. We return now to the third speaker for Ireland, David Byrne.
Is it okay if I speak here? Yeah?
Yep.
Camera's not gonna get you, but
Okay.
you want to copy it?
Makes me feel taller.
You want like the almanac? Stand on.
That's okay. Chairperson, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, Hugh's my Valentine. You're going to have to wait till next year. Team Ireland gave you today the team line that inflicting pain brings no gain to the child or society. We've given you our 3 points, and what I want to do is give you 3 questions that have emerged come the end of this debate. Firstly, is physical punishment bad for children? We say yes, it is. Secondly, is physical punishment good for society? We say no, it isn't. And thirdly, is there an effective alternative to these punishments? We say yes, there is. Firstly, is this physical punishment bad for children? And we say yes, it is. The Israeli team today started out with a concession, ladies and gentlemen. They told you that this would only apply to children above 6 because they recognise all the harms, mental and physical, to a child, ladies and gentlemen, below the age of 6. What they didn't do in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, was show you why when you suddenly hit the age of 7, you suddenly become able to take those mental, to take those physical pains, and for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, they never justified why under 6. We say that's a concession. We say when you're 7 years old and until you're 18, ladies and gentlemen, there's still a physical punishment there. There's still a mental punishment there. We showed you the abuse. We asked, if parental rights are so important to this team, why do they allow the state to limit it when children are below the age of 6? We haven't got an answer on that. We say this does lead to serious abuse, ladies and gentlemen. When you breed a society where people grow up thinking that violence is a possible solution, when you allow a parent to slap a child, there can be, in the heat of a moment, ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen, a translation from this to physical abuse, which is already mandated, already legislated for.
Sir.
We say that under Team Ireland's proposition, we remove these circumstances. We show the parent that in any case of abuse, ladies and gentlemen, in any case of physical punishment, there will be repercussions. It is not okay. We say this proposition prevents the abuse of children. We were given then, ladies and gentlemen, the idea that once a child hits 6 or 7, they suddenly start learning things about right and wrong. But apart from that, these kids who start learning things like right and wrong are too stupid, ladies and gentlemen, to know when something's hot or cold, to know that they shouldn't be jumping into a fire. We say that when you tell us the parents can explain things 1 trillion times to a 7-year-old, ladies and gentlemen, and it doesn't work, it's not quite believable, the idea that it doesn't work. They told you that that this kind of punishment was the only way. We showed you the harms at stake here. We say that it's kind of funny that they expect kids to be learning right and wrong at school, and yet they're unable to learn simple things like why it's dangerous not to cross a road, ladies and gentlemen, when there's no green man present. We say that even if this age restriction is lifted, even if we ignore this case still falls for Team Ireland. We say there are perfectly fine punishments which can be gotten without violence. We say there doesn't need to be the mental stress, the violation of the sanctity at home. We say that when you give a child a punishment through something like taking away their toys, and when you then actually explain to them what was right and what was wrong about what they did, ladies and gentlemen, a child gets a much clearer picture of the right, ladies and gentlemen, which is not doing the wrong, and they aren't told that the right, ladies and gentlemen, is to choose violence. We say, is this kind of punishment, physical punishment, bad for children? Yes, it is. Secondly, is this kind of punishment good for society? We say no, it isn't. We were told by Team Israel that this is an abuse, so it's all right. We don't ban shiny things, ladies and gentlemen, because people might steal them. And in the status quo, it doesn't lead to abuse. All these things we brought up. We say, firstly, this is abuse. We say something that causes this kind of mental harm, something which violates the sanctity of the parent-child relationship, destroys the sanctuary that should be for a child, the home, is certainly, ladies and gentlemen, quite the abuse. We say it's not good enough to keep rolling back on the idea that a child might touch a stove and not get used to the idea that it actually hurts them. We say it does lead to further abuse. As we've talked before, ladies and gentlemen, Team Ireland have made it clear in this debate that when you teach someone that violence is a solution, a parent carries that through into their punishment. When a parent uses violence as a punishment, there is a very thin line, ladies and gentlemen, in the heat of the moment between the abuse we're talking about here and the abuse they've already legislated for. We say in that thin line, which they create, by not banning this kind of physical punishment, there will be children, ladies and gentlemen, who get that extra mile in terms of the punishment. This will lead to further abuse. This will lead to kids with broken bones, ladies and gentlemen. We say it's not good enough to tell you that it's necessary. Tell me why that's not true.
Sir, parents love their children. They're not going to break their bones. They don't do it so in status quo.
Ladies and gentlemen, we say if a parent loves their children, they can sit them down, they can talk to them, they can say what's right, what's wrong, and they can give them a punishment like taking away their toys. We say that if parents love their children, and if it was such an absolute rule like Team Israel seem to be telling you it is, then we wouldn't have ever any cases of child abuse. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, in the real world, that's not the case, and so you can't just keep rolling back on that. We say under the proposition, we remove these circumstances whereby children get abused, and if parents do use any form of violence, then they know that there is no line that's okay and not okay. It's all not okay because of the mental, the physical harms that we pointed out on this side of the house. So, ladies and gentlemen, as to the question, is this kind of punishment good for society? We say no, it isn't. That it breeds a society that thinks that violence is okay, because Team Ireland has shown you that violence begets violence. That's a bad thing, ladies and gentlemen, if it wasn't clear enough already. Thirdly, is there an effective alternative to these kind of punishments? Team Ireland has showed you that yes, there is. We were given the idea all throughout this debate, and it may at this stage seem familiar to you, but we weren't given much else. The children simply don't learn. The children simply can't learn. And so they gave you, ladies and gentlemen, the easy way out. That when a parent feels slightly frustrated, it's okay. They don't have to explain to them the rights and the wrongs. They can just slap them and problem solve. The child learns everything. We say we choose a much slower and much more effective way of dealing with these things. We say a parent sits the child down and speaks to the child. We say that under their opposition, and I'll take you in a moment, sir, all that happens is that the right becomes violent. No.
And yet you have not explained to us once why a child is able to grasp abstract concepts.
We say a child is perfectly able to grasp the idea that they did something wrong, especially, ladies and gentlemen, after the age of 7, when they're able to deal with right and wrong according to Team Israel, because a parent can sit them down, explain to them right or wrong, give them a direct punishment in the form of taking something they like away. We say Team Israel's idea of showing them how something's wrong only shows them what's right to the parent. What's right being violence. And that's a bad thing for a child to grow up with. That's a bad method for a parent to be using to teach their child. We say under their opposition, violence becomes a right. We say talk to the child. It's slower. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not quite so easy. It lets people grow up in a safer environment. In the sanctuary, which is a home, ladies and gentlemen, after going out into the big wild world, we think it's important that a child be allowed to go home and not be in fear of their parents, something which wasn't answered. We've given you 3 points in this debate. How physical punishment harms children, the limits of parental choice, and the need to change how society views violence. Ladies and gentlemen, inflicting pain brings no gain to the child or society, and we on Team Ireland move to propose. Thank you.
Thank David for that speech. We move now to the opposition again, and their first speaker is Joseph Talbot.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a religious Jew. I don't have Valentine's Day. I don't need Valentine's Day. I'm just that good. Having finished with the humorous introduction, let's get on to the debate. So, the first thing we'd like to clear up is that the third speaker of the proposition appears to have misunderstood the claim we made at the beginning of the debate. We did not say for children above the age of about 6, we said for children below the age of about 6, because children beneath that age are not capable of grasping abstract concepts, an issue that I'll be dealing with later in my speech. This renders much of what was said during the third speech of the proposition rather irrelevant. And the rest, I hope I will be dealing with throughout my speech. So, essentially 2 issues that have been raised throughout this debate are the issue of, is there any alternative to physical punishment? In other words, is physical punishment really necessary? And secondly, the question of abuse. Does physical punishment fall under the criteria for abuse as they are recognized for all laws pertaining to the government interfering within the parent's jurisdiction? And both of these I will be dealing with. Now, on the issue of alternatives, no thank you, of course we have 2 alternatives to physical punishment. The first is sitting down and explaining to a child that what he's done is wrong, which both sides have agreed is fairly ineffectual. The second one is some other form of punishment, which is such as taking away a child's toys, and so on. Now, as I said, the first one, both sides essentially agreed was ineffectual. By the expression on the face of the proposition, you understand that they don't think so. So let me explain this in brief. Has anybody here ever heard of Sigmund Freud, ladies and gentlemen? I hope so. It goes like this: when a child is born, all that's within him is essentially animal instincts, as it were. No, thank you. Within a child's brain are the basic instincts that were implanted there. A child doesn't understand the concept of morality. A child doesn't understand the concept of right and wrong. No, thank you. Until those parts of his mind which are equipped to deal with this develop, which usually occurs about the age of 6. No, thank you. Therefore, at this age, simply explaining things isn't enough, because a child functions at the level of an animal. His brain and mind have not developed enough. No, thank you. To understand abstract explanations. Now, on the issue of all the other alternatives that were presented to us, such as taking away a child's such as taking away a child's toys and so on. And to this we say that firstly, this thing is simply not as simply in the vast majority of cases not as direct as physical punishment, and doesn't create as clear a link. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we would say that physical punishment is by definition the most effective of all possible punishments that can be administered in children this young, because they're functioning at a very, very basic and above all a very, very physical level. One moment please. Therefore, for example, if you take away a child's trains, he still might think that playing with the cat and trying to stick it in the microwave is a far better toy than those trains. Whereas physical pain, because of the way human beings are wired, is by definition a very, very bad punishment. Yes.
If children are developing morality at this age, then why do you want to teach them that violence is a solution to problems?
Sit down, please. Now, on the issue of teaching children that violence is an issue, that violence is the solution to problems, we have two things to say. Firstly, this is something that should be used only in very, very specific cases. We're not teaching children that violence is always the solution to their problems. Certainly, we'd encourage, no thank you, using other forms of punishment when, and in specific cases, when these would indeed be effective. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we say that physical punishment, no thank you, is fundamentally different from violence as we understand it in a negative context. We say that physical punishment is very, very controlled and should never be administered in anger. And furthermore, that physical punishment, by definition, has a reason. And that when the child hits the age when he is capable of understanding moral rationales, then you can sit down and explain to him exactly what that reason was, and that's cut the connection between violence and something positive. No, thank you. Now, so that was on the issue of alternatives. We say simply that physical punishment is by definition the most fundamental negative enforcement that can be used, and is therefore by definition worse than whatever gain the child might see in doing the action we want him to avoid, as opposed to other punishments which are always going to be relative. No, thank you. So onto the issue of abuse. Now, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say that side proposition never really dealt with the issue of abuse very well at all. They never talked about what exactly is it that are the criteria for abuse in the first place, as our second speaker did indeed talk about. We say that abuse is something that does any lasting actual harm to a child. Harm, ladies and gentlemen, which should be differentiated, no thank you, from pain, because that's what was shown. But any punishment that should be taken creates pain in a child. Taking away a child's toys, if what you're talking about is efficient in any case, would cause emotional pain, which is why it works as a punishment anyway. Pain isn't enough to signify harm to the individual, yes.
With our alternatives, you are not violating the sanctity of the home relationship for
Sit
parent
down,
and
please.
child.
Right, now then, that's an issue that I will be getting onto later in my speech. Now, then they talked about how it is that we should ban this because it might lead to abuse. But, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that it might lead on isn't enough of a rationale for me to ban it. And if I'm the kind of person who's inclined to break the laws of abuse in any case, then I would be the kind of person who would be inclined to abuse my child anyway. The fact that we're allowing rational people to employ physical punishment doesn't really increase this chance. Now then, onto the issue. Yes.
Sir, you can't just divide the world up into rational and irrational people. If you allow the idea that people can take their hands to their children in the first place,
ladies and gentlemen, the basis of the criminal code is that people respect the law simply by dint of it being the law. I return again to our second speaker's shiny objects example. So, then moving on to the issue that was presented and was blown up a lot by the proposition, which is to do with the sanctity of home life. And to this we have several things to say. And we have to say firstly, and our second speaker said several things on this, but firstly we'd like to say this is very, very infrequent and doesn't really violate the sanctity of home life, as our second speaker did indeed talk about. But another thing that I'd like to add on to all the things that hopefully the judges have written down that no one spoke about is simply this: any punishment by definition is going to violate the sanctity of home life, right? Any negative enforcement is going to make the child feel a little less safe and a little less protected within his within his or her own home. And we don't, and side proposition failed to show us why this is fundamentally different from any other form of punishment that might be employed. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, what have I shown you today? I've spoken about the issue of alternatives and how it is that physical punishment is the most fundamental punishment, and therefore, in certain children, the only useful punishment that can be employed in certain cases. And furthermore, on the issue of abuse, I've shown that quite simply, side proposition has failed to show us throughout all three of their speeches how physical punishment does indeed constitute abuse, and therefore why it should be banned, and it should be banned under the entire rationale of parenting. And for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we beg to oppose.
Okay, I thank Joseph for that and all of the 6 constructive speakers so far. We're now going to hear the summary speeches from each side, beginning with the opposition. That speech will be delivered by Shimon Friedman.
Before I get on to summarizing this debate, I'd like to just address one thing that my third speaker said, and that is, by dint of being a religious Jew, I don't want a Valentine. And I'd just like to say, ladies and gentlemen, I would like a Valentine, and so offers are open to anyone in the room. But now, ladies and gentlemen, let's really look at what this debate summed down to, and let's really look at what both sides had to say to us, and quite frankly, I'll prove you why Team Opposition has to win this debate. So I believe we have 2 main questions that we have to talk about at the end of the day in this debate. For Team Opposition to win, they had to prove to us that that status quo, what's happening in status quo, is in fact abuse. And so what we're going to be discussing first is this in fact abuse? The second thing I'd like to discuss is, are there alternatives that are relative? And finally, I'll go on and discuss what Team Opposition has shown today and why exactly we are correct. Now, we'd like to just stress again that Team Proposition never gave us specific criterions to what abuse is and what are not. And so that's why maybe it was a bit messy what Team Proposition tried to say to us. But we think they came up with 2 reasons about why this is abuse. And the first one is, well, it is because it can lead to abuse. And what we'd like to say to that, ladies and gentlemen, is just, first of all, the fact that it can lead to abuse doesn't mean is abuse directly, and therefore is not a reason to ban this. And second of all, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like Team Proposition, which they haven't done throughout these speeches, to prove to us why by something that might come ahead, that is abuse. Why we should ban that. Because like my second speaker said, and we continue down the line, the fact that something is shiny and may make you steal doesn't mean that we're going to ban shiny things. It means we're going to stop theft. And ladies and gentlemen, so the fact that it just may happen, abuse may happen, we don't believe stands. Now they came up and said, well, it creates emotional pain, and we won't see the home as a place of sanctity, your home as sanctity. And what we want is, emotional pain, and there will be a bad connotation with your parents and your home. But what we'd like to say, ladies and gentlemen, is that we do believe that having a bad connotation with a bad thing is a good thing. If you have a bad connotation in your head, if you feel pain when you look at fire again, then we believe that is a good thing. That connotation, that emotional stress in your mind is something positive, because hopefully next time you want to stick your hand in the road, stick your hand in the fire or run into the road, you'll remember that hurts, that pain can come from that, and you won't do it again. And that also, ladies and gentlemen, speaks about the sanctity of home, because many punishments can create, you'll be afraid to come home, ladies and gentlemen, because your parents generally love you, and if they abuse you, then we take you away from them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, are there alternatives? And first of all, let's come up with the whole idea of that we can explain to them what we do. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, these are not mutually exclusive. We can explain to them what they did, but also we have to show them there is a direct pain by doing this. And what they came up to say is, well, if we take the toy away, then this is effective. But ladies and gentlemen, we see that this isn't effective, because if that toy is taken away, then I can find another toy, or I can find fun in doing something else. There is not an efficient alternative. And I think it was second speaker on Team Proposition, agreed to the fact that, ladies and gentlemen, this is more effective, that the idea of inflicting pain is more effective, and it's something that they agree. They just believe it's immoral, but I prove to you it's not immoral, because we prove to you that it is not abuse, and therefore is okay. And we would rather go with a more effective thing, because if it's not abuse and it is more effective, as second speaker for Team Proposition said, then I would not like to take the chance of just explaining something to my child when he runs into the road without looking, and I wouldn't like to take the chance of him running into the road again and God forbid something happening to him, I'd like to use the most efficient way to explain to him that what he did is bad and that we have to, and that he cannot do it again. And so we see, ladies and gentlemen, the team proposition didn't really show to us why this is abuse and didn't prove to us this is abuse, and this is the most crucial thing for them to do. It's prove to us why this is abuse, because only then can we ban it towards the parents, and they never showed us an efficient alternative. And we showed you, ladies and gentlemen, that a child only understands pain, that a child does not understand other things, and we proved to you that it is within the parents' right to do so, and that's why, ladies and gentlemen, the motion must fall. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks Shimon very much for that speech. I'm now going to call the final speaker for Ireland and in the debate, Hugh Burns.
Ladies and gentlemen, I began this debate with no Valentines. I now have 2, so I think that whatever the result, I will have gained something from all this. But I do believe also that at the end of this debate, the arguments of Team Ireland do remain standing, and the team line that inflicting pain brings no gain to the child or to the parent. But let's take a look firstly at the case which Team Israel brought to us, and it was a case that, as the debate went on, became more and more reliant on misrepresentation and assertion. It can be summarized under 2 headings. Firstly, this idea of physical punishment and teaching children how to act. And here, Team Israel gave you a view of the world whereby we should treat children like animals, like people with animal instincts, who need to have right and wrong beaten into them. And we in Team Ireland always agreed that these children are developing morality for the first time. But what we suggested was that for a child gaining its first sense of morality, perhaps teaching them that violence was a solution to a problem wasn't the best thing for a parent to be doing. They told you that we're only going to be doing this in specific instances. We're only going to be doing this in a controlled way. But on Team Ireland, we never thought that children should ever be taught that violence is a solution to a problem, be it a specific instance, be it what they perceive as a controlled use of violence. What Team Ireland also told you here was that there was no real effective difference between other forms of punishment if you want to teach people right and wrong. That there is a clear causal link between having your toys taken away and the infraction you committed. And that if they play with another toy, the parent can take all the toys away, ladies and gentlemen. The second area which Team Israel talked to you about was this idea of parents' rights. And they told you that parents' rights were brilliant, and that because parents have the best interests of their children at heart, they can be relied on not to do the wrong thing. What Team Ireland asked here was, if that's true, why do we restrict parents' rights at all? Why do we ban them from sending their children to work as child labourers? Why do we ban other forms of abuse? What we suggested was that the rights of the parent shouldn't be put ahead of the basic rights of the child to things like bodily integrity, to freedom from assault, that these things are basic to any human being's existence. So let's take a look at the arguments which Team Ireland brought to the table. And the first was this idea of abuse and of the physical punishment harming children. And Ireland talked at length about the pain and psychological damage which physical punishment leads to. And in response to this, we heard this constant assertion from Team Israel that in order for something to count as harm, it must leave some sort of long-term damage. Firstly, Team Ireland always thought that in the short term, feeling completely dominated by another person, having your bodily integrity infracted upon, and yes, suffering pain can be viewed as harm reasonably. But secondly, it was a misrepresentation for Israel to say that we didn't show long-term effects. We elaborated at length about the intense psychological damage that comes when you no longer feel that your home is a safe place where you can be free from bodily infraction. We talked at length about how parents about how children are being taught bad lessons about how to operate in society. The second thing Team Ireland talked to you about was the limitations of parents' rights. And here they showed you that parents' rights are limited all the time, that children are just as much human beings as anyone else, but their rights do deserve to be put ahead of the family unit. Thirdly, Team Ireland talked to you about the idea of the need to change how society changed violence. Team Ireland never agreed that corporal punishment was more effective than other forms of punishment, but what they told you was that a sea change was needed in how society views violence, that we needed to take away the last area where people could use violence as a solution to a problem, that we needed to conclude the process began when things like corporal punishment were gotten rid of in school. And Team Ireland stood strong on this point. So ladies and gentlemen, because inflicting pain brings no gain to the child or to society, I'm very, very happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. The judges will now concede.
Okay, I'm sorry.